There is a detail few people know. When the first German prisoners of war were brought to the United States in 1943, many were convinced they would be executed, or at the very least thrown into dark dungeons, condemned to live a wretched life of slavery. That was the image planted in their minds by Nazi propaganda. America was the land of Jews and lazy blacks, a realm of crime where prisoners would be tortured and starved to death. But when the Liberty ship carrying them from North Africa entered the port of Norfolk, Virginia, an entirely different scene unfolded before their eyes, so much so that some German officers exclaimed, "We have been deceived." In June 1943, Norfolk Harbor bustled with ship horns, the pungent smell of grease from enormous shipyards, and thousands of workers laboring without pause. In the diary of one German non-commissioned officer later discovered, he wrote, "We expected to see a poor, war-worn city. Instead, we saw thriving neighborhoods, shops overflowing with goods, trucks loaded with food and clothing. Everything seemed as if no war was taking place at all." For the prisoners, the greatest shock was not the tall buildings or the roaring convoys of jeeps. It was the way Americans lived their daily lives. Right beside the naval base, they saw white and black workers standing side by side, operating cranes and unloading cargo together. To German eyes, this was in complete contrast with the extreme racial segregation they had absorbed back home. Some even whispered to each other, if Hitler saw this, he would surely explode with rage. Even the smallest details became cultural shocks. One private wrote in a letter to his family, later censored and archived, "I saw an American child selling newspapers at the gate of the base. He stood there shouting the latest war news, while soldiers passed in and out without anyone stopping him." In Germany, such a boy would have been arrested by the Gestapo long ago. The Americans, instead of despising or torturing them, treated the prisoners strictly in line with the Geneva Convention. They were escorted off the ship in orderly fashion, under guard but without brutality. Some American officers even handed them water and cigarettes. One middle-aged prisoner later recalled, "When an American soldier gave me a cigarette and lit it for me, I could hardly believe it. In my head still echoed the German articles calling them savages. Moreover, the U.S. authorities provided interpreters to explain prisoners' rights in German. They would receive sufficient food, shelter, medical care, and could write letters home. For men who had just endured the brutal deserts of North Africa, this seemed like a paradox. Some prisoners looked at one another with suspicion, thinking it was merely a sweet trap before execution. The scene of German prisoners disembarking at Norfolk that day drew the curiosity of many Americans. Local families gathered, children in tow. Instead of shouting or throwing stones, they stood silently, some even watching with pity. A local newspaper reporter noted, "Strange it was. The very men who had once raised arms against us now looked less like cold-blooded enemies than weary, lost young men." The prisoners were then put on trains to be transported to camps inland. Along the way, they continued to witness the unbelievable. Vast fields of wheat, bustling small towns lined with shops, enormous steel mills spewing white smoke. They realized that the American economy was not only intact, but flourishing in wartime, something Germany, despite mobilizing all its resources, could never match. One German officer bitterly wrote in his diary, "We were taught that Americans were weak, divided, and undisciplined. But here I see a society overflowing with food, mass-producing weapons, and the strangest thing of all, people are not afraid. They live normally, even happily, though war is raging just beyond." For the younger prisoners, the experience was a cultural shock to the core. They saw not only prosperity, but also diversity in American society, where blacks, immigrants, and women alike contributed to the war effort. And a question began to smolder in their minds. If Nazi propaganda had lied about America, what else had they hidden from us? As the train carried them deeper inland toward the first camps in Texas, a new chapter in the lives of these prisoners was about to unfold. What awaited them inside the American POW camps? A hidden paradise, or another more sophisticated trap? If World War II were a giant chessboard, then from 1943 onward, The United States was not only the queen sweeping across the battlefield, but also quietly built a hidden kingdom in the heart of its continent, the vast network of German prisoner-of-war camps. These were not makeshift enclosures scattered here and there, but a massive system stretching from the East Coast to the Midwest, from the sun-scorched plains of Texas to the cold forests of Michigan. At its height, this system held as many as 425,000 German POWs, a number that astonished the world. For comparison, all of Britain, a nation directly bombed and battered by war, held only around 170,000 German prisoners. The Soviet Union, despite its bloody front, could not maintain stable conditions for its millions of captives. Meanwhile, the United States, half a world away, turned its own soil into the most luxurious place of captivity the enemy would ever know. Camp Hearn in Texas, often dubbed the Nazi Hilton, was a prime example. Built across hundreds of acres, it not only had sturdy wooden barracks and a modern infirmary, but also a library with thousands of books, soccer fields, a chapel, and even a theater stage. In 1944-1945 alone, prisoners staged more than 60 concerts, dozens of plays, and art exhibitions, transforming their place of captivity into a miniature cultural city. To grasp the organizational might of America, imagine a Swiss watch, every cog, every spring moving in perfect rhythm. From the seaports, prisoners were loaded onto trains, transported thousands of miles, and delivered straight to pre-built camps. There they were classified by rank and political belief, then assigned to suitable labor. All of it unfolded like clockwork, without chaos. While camps in the Soviet Union or the Balkans conjured images of rags, hunger, and disease, the American camps resembled sociological laboratories. Prisoners were allowed to elect self-governing councils with small budgets to run internal activities. They published German-language newspapers, writing about poetry, philosophy, even debates about democracy. Once declassified, these papers revealed a shocking truth. Inside the camps, many German officers had already begun questioning their own Nazi faith. Figures from the U.S. War Department show that each day, a German POW consumed rations equal to, or sometimes better than, those given to Black American soldiers in uniform, a paradox reflecting both generosity and racial inequality in U.S. society. The menus included meat, fresh vegetables, milk, and occasionally beer. For many prisoners, these meals were richer than anything they had ever seen at home during wartime. But the pinnacle was the POW labor system. Hundreds of thousands of Germans became a crucial labor force for American agriculture during the manpower shortage. In Texas, Kansas, and Nebraska, they harvested cotton, corn, and wheat, saving entire crops while American youth fought overseas. The U.S. even paid them in coupons, which they could use in camp canteens. Altogether, German POWs contributed millions of labor hours, the equivalent of tens of thousands of American workers. Picture it. Men who once commanded panzer tanks or shelled London now stooping under the hot sun, cutting cabbages or packing fruit crates for American farmers. It was like a Greek tragedy, where the proud are cast down and forced to toil under the very enemy they once despised. The contrast with other nations only highlighted the superiority of the American model. In Britain, prisoners were crammed into warehouses without self-governance. In the Soviet Union, millions perished from hunger or cold. In America, many actually gained weight during captivity. A 1945 medical report noted that German POWs in the U.S. gained an average of 2 to 5 kilograms after 1 year. This was nearly unthinkable for anyone labeled a prisoner of war. Beyond food and shelter, they also carried fragments of the American dream within the barbed wire. On summer nights in Texas, prisoners strummed guitars and sang German folk songs. At Christmas, guards allowed them to erect trees, sing carols, even receive small gifts from local communities. Many young American soldiers watching this were astonished. We thought they were the enemy, but they looked more like neighbors. This image became a powerful metaphor. America defeated Nazism not only with bullets, but with the soft power of prosperity and humanity. If the battlefield crushed the German army with bombs and shells, The POW camps eroded Nazi ideology bit by bit, with full plates, free newspapers, and warm Christmas nights. At its height, the American POW system became a mirror turned backward. It exposed the truth Nazi propaganda never wanted its citizens to see. On one side stood noisy, diverse, often contradictory America, yet free and prosperous. On the other, Germany suffocated under Gestapo control, bombs, and hunger. Not a few prisoners wrote haunting lines in their diaries. If Germany loses the war, I want to live in a place like this. The question was no longer whether America could successfully detain its prisoners, but this. What would happen when hundreds of thousands of Germans returned from these paradises in captivity, carrying memories of a free society? If the golden wheat fields of Kansas or the massive factories of Ohio had already sown seeds of doubt in the minds of German prisoners, then it was inside the barbed wire fences of the POW camps that the decisive blow was struck. Here they faced not Sherman tanks or B-17 flying fortresses, but a far more unexpected opponent, American democracy, small in appearance, yet immensely powerful. From the moment they entered Camp Hearn, Texas, Camp Algona, Iowa, or Fort Robinson, Nebraska, the prisoners immediately noticed something unusual. These camps didn't look like prisons. Rows of wooden barracks, barbed wire fences, guard towers, yes, all of that was there. But inside, the atmosphere was closer to that of a small town. There were libraries, classrooms, sports fields, chapels, and even theaters. Compared to the hellish labor camps they had imagined, this felt like a strange land conjured in the shadows of war. The most striking difference was the system of self-governance. Americans allowed the prisoners to elect camp councils, divide responsibilities, and organize daily life. Each barracks block had a leader, a cultural committee, even sports organizers. One German POW later recalled, "We were stunned. Back home, even a minor complaint could bring the Gestapo. Here, we could vote, we could debate. The Americans simply stood by and observed." America's technological might also appeared in unexpected ways. The Hearn Camp Library held over 6,000 books, ranging from American novels and science texts to works of philosophy. Prisoners could study English, mathematics, even mechanics, subjects the U.S. authorities knew would plant seeds for the future. At Algona, the prisoners even built a 3-story wooden theater out of recycled lumber, staging Goethe plays, Mozart operas, and satirical comedies mocking the Nazis. It was living proof of how intellect and creativity flourished when placed in a free environment. The contrast with the enemy was stark. In Soviet camps, Germans staggered in hunger, many dying on forced marches. In Europe, British camps were safe but harsh and lacking. In America, prisoners played soccer, wrestled, painted, and wrote poetry. Some of their artworks were mailed back to Germany, where astonished families could hardly believe it. "My son is living like he's at a boarding school in America?" Perhaps the most shocking sight was the music. Prisoners who had once been musicians or conductors were now permitted to form bands inside the camps. They played Beethoven and Wagner, but also practiced jazz and swing, genres banned by the Nazis as degenerate. The first time the brassy sound of American jazz echoed behind the barbed wire, a German officer broke down in tears. "I cannot believe this. In Germany, just listening to this would be enough to land me in the hands of the Gestapo. Here they applaud." That emotional shock spread like wildfire. Many prisoners began asking themselves, if their enemy allowed such dangerous things to exist, and even encouraged them, then perhaps America's true strength was not in its Shermans or B-29s, but in its willingness to let ideas clash freely. In the eyes of the POWs, American democracy was like an invisible but gigantic machine. It needed no dense guard towers, no refined methods of torture, yet it still compelled the enemy to acknowledge its allure. When a faction of hardcore Nazis tried to maintain a mini Third Reich within the camp, it was the other prisoners who stood up to oppose them, demanding open discussion. That was the greatest shock of all. The idea of freedom began to triumph over Nazi iron discipline, without a single bullet fired. A U.S. War Department report noted that by 1945, Among the more than 400,000 German POWs in America, tens of thousands had voluntarily enrolled in classes on democracy, law, and modern governance. The numbers were impressive not just as education, but as evidence of the overwhelming pull of that invisible adversary, the idea of liberty. For many young prisoners, it was their first time reading uncensored newspapers. Camp Hearn stocked translated editions of the New York Times, Time magazine, and local papers. They saw Americans criticize their president, mock their generals, even lampoon their government, right in the middle of a world war. One German officer exclaimed, "If I did this in Berlin, I'd have been dead long ago." Here it's their morning entertainment. The fear did not come from whips or starvation, but from the crumbling of belief. For many, it was a shock greater than the sound of bombs. The discovery that the entire foundation of Nazi ideology might be nothing more than a castle of sand, while the democratic society they had been taught to despise stood firm and thriving. Imagine a German officer who once shouted "Sieg Heil" in perfectly aligned ranks, now sitting in a classroom in Texas, listening to a lecture on the U.S. Constitution and civil rights, silently wondering, what have we been fighting for? Have we been deceived all along? It was here, behind the barbed wire, that America's enemy was no longer the mighty Wehrmacht, but men undergoing a profound crisis of faith. And that was the fatal blow. The question now was, what would happen when that doubt turned into action? When prisoners began resisting Nazi ideology from within the camps themselves? On June 6, 1944, thousands of German soldiers held in American POW camps were allowed to hear the news broadcast over the radio. When the BBC announcer's voice declared, "The Allied forces have landed on the beaches of Normandy," an eerie silence fell across the camps. A few German officers stubbed out their half-smoked cigarettes, their eyes staring into the distance. In that moment, they understood that the war had entered its final act, though none dared say it aloud. In the months leading up to that day, reports from the front had trickled in relentlessly. In February 1943, the disaster at Stalingrad erased 6 German divisions. The staggering figure of 91,000 German soldiers captured by the Soviets shook Hitler's propaganda machine to its core. For Germans sitting in a camp in Texas, the number brought a shattering realization. They had once believed the Wehrmacht was invincible. One prisoner wrote in his diary, "If we could lose at Stalingrad, what hope is left for Germany?" The collapse continued. In 1943, when the Allies captured Sicily and advanced into Italy, new groups of POWs arrived on American soil. They told fellow prisoners how American jeeps drove straight into towns, how German soldiers threw down their rifles and raised their hands because they could not withstand the crushing artillery barrages and heavy bombers overhead. These stories were like knives carving deeper into the already crumbling faith of those imprisoned across the Atlantic. Yet not all prisoners accepted the truth. Hardline Nazis, often SS officers or men raised in the Hitler Youth, clung to the dream of the Wunderwaffe, the miracle weapons. They believed the V-2 rockets or the Me-262 jet fighters would turn the tide. Within the camps, 2 factions emerged, one composed of the wide-eyed realists who saw defeat as inevitable, the other of fanatics who enforced discipline and spread fear. The war within the wire could be as brutal as the one outside. At Camp Tonkawa, Oklahoma, in 1943, a young prisoner named Johannes Kunze was murdered by his fellow Germans, accused of being a traitor simply for suggesting that Germany could not win. Kunze's death shocked American military police, an assassination carried out inside barbed wire. The U.S. press called it a camp of 2 Germanys, one blindly loyal, the other slowly awakening. The imbalance of power between the 2 nations was revealed in numbers too stark to ignore. From 1942 to 1944, the United States produced over 49,000 heavy bombers. Germany built fewer than 5,000. America manufactured 49,234 Sherman tanks, more than the combined total of Panzer IVs and Panthers. German POWs working on Texas farms saw trains pass by, hauling dozens of brand-new Shermans. One Wehrmacht officer exclaimed, "We have been fighting an entire factory." Normandy was the undeniable turning point. When hundreds of thousands of Allied troops smashed through the Atlantic Wall, news of the chaotic German retreat in France reached the American camps. Prisoners whispered among themselves, how could the Wehrmacht resist an enemy so vast, so well supplied? The propaganda that painted America as weak and decadent shattered completely against the reality they were living in, the land of steel, wheat, and automobiles. The climax came in the winter of 1944. With the Ardennes, the Battle of the Bulge, Hitler's final gamble. Its catastrophic failure brought reports of 120,000 German soldiers killed, wounded, or captured in a matter of weeks. Prisoners huddled around the radio, their hearts heavy. One wrote, "No miracles remain. All that's left is waiting for the end." The mood inside the wire shifted. In the early months, prisoners had still marched in neat ranks, singing military songs. Now only hollow eyes remained. Many signed up for English classes, volunteered for extra work, or buried themselves in books to escape the grim news from home. Some even sought friendship with the American Guards, realizing that their former enemies would soon decide Germany's fate. From the supposed invincible army of 1940, the Wehrmacht and the entire Third Reich collapsed before the very eyes of its own soldiers, locked behind barbed wire on the far side of the ocean. They witnessed their journey from absolute faith to irreversible disillusionment. The haunting question now was this: when the war finally ended, what would these men, once bitter enemies, but now witnesses to the raw power of democracy, choose for the future of their homeland? In May 1945, Germany officially surrendered. At that moment, hundreds of thousands of German soldiers imprisoned on American soil quietly received the news that the war was over. There was no cheering, no weeping, only a heavy silence, for everyone understood. Their homeland had been reduced to ashes. Berlin lay in ruins, millions were dead, and all the ideals once drilled into their minds had dissolved into ghosts. Yet within that silence, a historic turning point began. The barbed wire did more than confine the prisoners' bodies. It inadvertently became a school of democracy. During their captivity, they witnessed with their own eyes the very things Nazi propaganda had always denied. A free press criticizing the government even in wartime, multi-ethnic communities living side by side, women and black Americans working in factories or even wearing uniforms. Most important of all, they saw that America did not tremble before war. It transformed its industrial power and democratic spirit into its sharpest weapon. More than 425,000 German POWs were held in the U.S. between 1942 and 1946. They worked on farms, in construction, and in industry, indirectly fueling America's economy as the war escalated. Many farmers in Texas, Alabama, or Kansas even wrote letters, thanking the U.S. Army for German workers more disciplined and diligent than our own locals. But the true significance lay not in harvests or production figures. It lay in the long-term impact these men carried home. In 1946, trains carrying POWs began rolling out of American ports. Some returned to Germany, stepping into towns reduced to rubble. Others were first sent to Britain or France to labor in reconstruction before finally going home. But in their baggage, they carried more than memories of war. They carried a new model of society, one that Germany would later emulate to rise from the ashes. Many prisoners admitted that they first learned the meaning of true democracy while in America. Newspapers in the camps, though censored, still reflected multiple viewpoints. Evening classes taught by American professors opened doors to new knowledge. And when they encountered Western philosophy, from Kant and Goethe to Thomas Jefferson, many young soldiers realized that Germany's future need not be shackled to dictatorship, but could instead be built on freedom. There was a profound paradox. It was only in defeat. While their soldiers were behind barbed wire, the Germans were exposed to the very lessons that would help their nation be reborn. Many of these men later became teachers, engineers, and civil servants in the Federal Republic of Germany. helping transform West Germany into a solid democratic ally of the United States during the Cold War. Of course, not everyone changed. Some clung bitterly to Nazi beliefs, living out their lives in resentment. But for the majority, their POW years in America were like a window opening onto another world. Personal stories left their mark. One former prisoner recalled that on Christmas 1944, a Texas farming family secretly sent him a cake and a card reading, "We hope you'll soon be reunited with your family. German or American, we are all human." That moment convinced him that hatred was not an unbreakable fate. Years later, he became a schoolteacher in Hamburg, telling his students that war was a painful lesson never to be repeated. For America, too, the experience of holding German prisoners carried lasting lessons. Americans realized that humane treatment was not only an obligation under the Geneva Convention, but also a long-term strategy. Every prisoner treated with dignity could become an ambassador upon returning home, helping dismantle the legacy of hatred. This was how the U.S. planted political influence in the heart of its defeated enemy, a strategy as effective as bombs, but far gentler. In the broader view, the story of German POWs in America illustrates one of the great paradoxes of modern war. Sometimes the defeated learn the most from the victors. On Europe's battlefields, bullets determined life and death. But in the camps of Texas, Arkansas, and Oklahoma, it was humane conduct and the spirit of democracy that proved to be the decisive weapon. This is why, just 10 years after the war ended, West Germany stood as a member of NATO, shoulder to shoulder with the United States, a scenario unimaginable back in 1943, when the first convoys of POWs were still crossing the Atlantic. The larger lesson here belongs not only to America or Germany, but to all of humanity. War can destroy cities, but how we treat our enemies determines whether peace will be built to last. If in war America's ultimate weapon was industry and technology, then in peace its greatest weapon was the power of humanity. More than 80 years have passed. The camps are gone, overgrown fields of grass. Yet their memory still burns faintly in history, reminding us that sometimes victory is not measured by enemy corpses or captured cities, but by planting in the heart of the defeated a new seed, the seed of freedom. And when that seed takes root, it can rebuild an entire nation from the ashes. For in the end, what remains after war is not fallen walls or bomb craters, but faith. The faith that even in the darkest hour, people can still choose humanity. And that faith is the most enduring legacy of every war.